Hi everyone out there. My name is Tóth. First time we meet and through the camera only, and it's very hard to me. Hard to talk to a glass in front of me. I love to have your eyes to be caught, but this is the situation during pandemia, and we should cope with it. You will cope with it. Today I'm going to talk about the parts of the nervous system, and especially the peripheral nervous system we should deal with. The first picture shows you the importance of the spinal cord. Everyone knows that the skull has got a brain, and in the vertebral column there is a spinal cord extending down. And people tend to not consider the spinal cord as a very important part of the brain. But just imagine any pain for the periphery of the body is transmitted through pathways leading up to the brain. So spinal cord is equally important part of the nervous system. So let's talk about the divisioning the different parts of the nervous system. According to function, first, something could be somatic and something could be autonomic or vegetative function. If you got trouble to decide what the function one thing belongs to, you should always ask yourself whether you can influence the function by your mind or it is independent from your mind. It applies to both sensations and motor activity. Everything controlled by the cerebral cortex, by your mind, is somatic, and everything which is independent from it, it is autonomic function. But perhaps you know this from high school. The autonomic nervous system, again functionally, should be divided into two big portions, always working opposite to each other, against each other. The same function is influenced by both of them, and one increases, the other depresses this function. Again, if you want to know which autonomic function something belongs to, you should ask yourself whether it is in serve of a very quiet stage, if you are resting somewhere and eat after having eaten something and watching the television. That is parasympathetic, that is function of the parasympathetic innervation. The opposite applies to sympathetic. If you are in danger, there's a flight or fight reflex, perhaps you've heard that. In this case, your body should be ready to fight or ready to run, and therefore the blood, most of the blood, is going to the limbs instead of going to the GI tract, like it was the case in the parasympathetic stage or parasympathetic innervation. According to position, you also must divide the nervous system into central and peripheral nervous systems. As I told you today, the central is not to be discussed in detail, only the peripheral we should put the emphasis. Peripheral nervous system consists of nerves and consists of ganglia scattered within this nerve system outside the central nervous system. The nerves may leave the brain, and according to that, these nerves are the cranial nerves, 12 pairs of them. Today we should discuss them in detail, as well as 31 pairs of spinal nerves leaving the spinal cord belong to the peripheral nervous system. Ganglia, again, should be divided into two different groups. One is sensory ganglion, of course the sensory, in the way of the sensory pathway, the ganglion is found, and autonomic, which was like this, independent from the cerebral cortex. And autonomic also, like all the autonomic system, autonomic ganglia, should belong to two classes, sympathetic or parasympathetic ganglia. There is no morphological difference between the two, but functionally. Some of basic terms, if you want definitions, very good to know. For example, the ganglion is nothing but accommodation of cell bodies, pericardia, the nerve cell body is called pericardion, in the peripheral nervous system. The parts of the neuron, again, it must be familiar to you. Big portions, each neuron consists of a body, soma, pericardion. I think it needs explanation. Peri I hope everyone knows, it means around something. Karyos is the nucleus. So of course, the body which is contains the nucleus and it's around the nucleus, that is called perikaryon. And the neuron has got several processes. There are two types of these processes. One is usually numerous, profusely branching or rarely branching, not far from the perikaryon. And only one process used to be the one which works as exit site of output site of the neuron. It extends far, usually far from the perikaryon. Sometimes could be the length of it could be 1.2 meters, even in my body. Consider the neuron in the spinal cord, and the axon of it goes down to the big toe, so quite a long axon the neuron has got, which finally branches. This is called telodendrion, doesn't matter, but branches, and gives potential, action potential to the postsynaptic target, to the other thing, which either could be neuron or could be some organs, like muscles, glands, or stuff in the periphery. Also, you can see that the axon is not naked, but it has got a sheath around. The sheaths we are going to talk about in another lecture. The sheaths consist of peripheral glial cells, and they make electric isolation for the axon itself, leaving some gaps in between the covering cells. These are the Ranvier's nodes of Ranvier, and action potential, therefore, can only jump from one node to other node. This is a saltatoric process, saltatoric transmission of action potential. Also, many times the axon has got local collateral by which it can influence other neurons in closer or bit farther vicinity of the neuron itself. Other basic term could be what a nerve is. These axons plus sheaths together are called nerve fibers, and if you pack them together, a bundle of nerve fibers equal to nerve. Nerve applies to peripheral nervous system only. You are going to see that the same things, accumulation of pericardia in the central nervous system, a bunch of nerve fibers in the central nervous system also found, but they've got different names. The nerve fibers, according to function, should be classified. One type is sensory, or also called afferent. Maybe it needs explanation. Adfero, that's where the word comes from, taking two. The other is motor fiber. This is the one which leaves the central nervous system and executes something in the periphery. These are called efferent fibers, coming from exfero, so taking away from something. The sensory fibers could be of somatic type. Again, you should ask whether you feel this, the sensation reaches your mind, reaches your cortex or not. That is somatic if it does. Like temperature, pain, superficial touch, vibration, so those things coming from the outer surrounding and being perceived by your mind. This equal to somatic sensation, somatic sensory afferents or somatic sensory fibers. The visceral also exists, but you are not aware of the visceral sensations. The visceral system continuously monitors the main function of the body, but your brain is not involved in this function, not occupied, not bored. For example, the central nervous system of mine knows the current oxygen tension of my blood, but I don't know. I knows the heartbeat rate, but I don't know. These are the autonomic sensory functions. It implies the osmolarity, gas tension, blood pressure, heartbeat rate, anything. And finally, there is a category consisted of special senses. You know that humans have got 6 special senses. and the special sensation includes the smelling, the vision, the hearing, equilibrium, and such stuffs. So these are the special sensory fibers. We are talking about the classification of fibers now. The motor or efferent fibers could be also somatic, and that is by which you can make your muscles, skeletal muscles, to contract. So, of course, your mind determines the final execution of a movement, and this order is sent down to lower levels, and finally, the answer is contraction of a muscle. Another function is the autonomic motor function. Again, heartbeat rate is influenced by it. So in general, any motor fiber which finally reaches or innervates smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. Again, can you increase your sweating on your front, for example, by your mind? You cannot. This is autonomic motor function. Or contract one of the arteries in the periphery. It could be done, but it is under control of autonomic nervous system. The autonomic, as before, had to be divided into sympathetic, parasympathetic. Previously, I told you examples to distinguish between the two. Now, after that, we should deal with the nerves itself, the names and function, main function of the nerves after the classification. So if nerve is meant, then you must be aware of the fiber content. So whether somatic sensory fibers only or mixed fibers. So that's what we should briefly summarize. Bad news to you that all the 12 pairs of cranial nerves are to be known for the final exam. Only with the most important functions only, but to be known by proper term as well as the number of them. Now there are 12, as I told you, all the 12 are here. So first cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve, and it is responsible for smelling, therefore it only consists of special sensory fibers. Just to tell the truth, these are not nerve fibers, which are the components of the olfactory nerve, but because in the olfactory region of the nasal cavity, I hope you've learned this area or region of the nasal cavity. The olfactory region contains primary sensory epithelial cells. The primary sensory epithelium is the one which has got its own process leading the information into the central nervous system, and that applies to these cells. So all these processes of the sensory epithelial cells all together make up the olfactory nerve. That's why it's not a real nerve. The same applies to the second one, which also consists of purely special sensory fibers responsible for vision, the visual perception. And this is again not a nerve. I don't know, maybe you are going to hear about this. In the retina, the primary processing of visual information starts. The retina should be considered as an exported part of the brain, so really it should be considered as part of the brain. And connection between part of the brain and other part of the brain should never be called nerve, should be properly called tract. But we call this optic nerve, the second cranial nerve. As well as the nerve has got different coverages than all the other peripheral nerves have got. It has got the same coverages as the central nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord has got. There are several proofs for that one, that this is not really a nerve, but rather a tract, a pathway. After the second, the third, the oculomotor comes. As the name indicates, this one is responsible for movements of the eye, so extraocular eye muscles. Most of the extraocular eye muscles are innervated by somatomotor fibers. But this one is the first, which is mixed and also contains parasympathetic fibers belonging to the parasympathetic nervous system. These fibers are responsible for accommodation reflex. Maybe later you are going to hear about this. So far distance, if you look at, then parallelly the eyes are set, and if closer and closer you look, more and more converging the eyesight should be. T, and that is called the accommodation, close accommodation, distal accommodation. So this is the function of these parasympathetic fibers, as well as the narrowing of the pupil is also a parasympathetic function. Once more, sitting fine in a chair and just looking at nothing, parallel set eyes plus narrow pupil. These are due to the parasympathetic innervation. The opposite applies to the sympathetic. Just to clear it for you a minute, if someone is afraid, there is a sympathetic stage, afraid of something, either fight or flight or anything need to be done, then people used to say that their eyes become wide. And not the eyes really, but the pupil is the one which widens due to the effect of the sympathetic innervation. So that one is a mixed cranial nerve, the oculomotor. After it, the fourth comes. The fourth is the trochlear. Very hard to explain the name, and I think you don't need explanation. No, trochlear nerve. I don't love anything to be left unclear, so I should tell you. One eye muscle, extraocular eye muscle, is innervated by the nerve, and this muscle has got a tendon which bends at acute angle in a small round ring, cartilaginous ring, and this ring is called trochleo. Trochleo is the thing by which you can lift something up. So through this one the tendon bends, and therefore the name innervating this muscle is trochlear nerve. Somatomotor fibers only, and only one extraocular muscle it innervates. The fifth comes the trigeminal. The name says that this is triple twin, trigemini. Trigeminal nerve necessarily consists of three main components. The first is called ophthalmic. The ophthalmic nerve is has got somatosensory fibers and responsible for the innervation of upper part of the skin of the head, mostly. The second explanation is needed. Ophthalmos in Greek means the eye. So something above the eye is innervated by fibers of the ophthalmic nerve. Everyone calls specialists dealing with the diseases of the eye ophthalmologists, so not hard to memorize the name ophthalmic nerve. The second division, the name comes from the bone holding the upper teeth here, the maxilla, so that is maxillary nerve, and roughly that stripe of the skin is innervated by its somatosensory fibers, because this is also purely clearly somatosensory. And the third division name comes from the lower jaw, the mandible. The name is mandibular, and this is the only mixed part of the trigeminal nerve, having the usual fiber composition, the somatosensory, as in the cases of the other two branches, and that innervates stripe of the skin roughly fitting with the arch to the arch of the mandible, but also has got somatomotor fibers. And these somatomotor fibers are innervating a group of muscle, important group of muscle, this one, muscles of mastication. So all the muscles moving the jaw during mastication should be innervated by the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. After that comes the abducent. Okay, the name indicates that it abducts something. Of course, not the arm or the thigh or something, but abducts the eye. Only one muscle is innervated, lying on the lateral side of the eye, and this is the muscle responsible for abduction of the eyes. Therefore, it is called abducent, and this is purely somatomotor nerve, cranial nerve. The facial nerve comes after that. The name doesn't need explanation, and the facial is the first one, which is extremely mixed. So it contains almost all the possible possible types of fibers. Here says that somatosensory, but with a very small letters are indicated, because only stripe of the skin within the external acoustic meatus, part of the auricule, the ear, is innervated by it. not much somatosensory, not many somatosensory fibers it has got. The somatomotor fibers are many, and these fibers innervate all the muscles of facial expression. The other component is parasympathetic, so autonomic component it has got, responsible for innervation of smaller, the big salivary glands, but amongst them the smaller ones are innervated by parasympathetic. And if during histology you will be asked whether serous or mucous secretion is under control of parasympathetic situation, referring back to the fight or flight reflex during sympathetic innervation, or just referring to exam situation. This is again a sympathetic stage, and many times during exam someone can hear tongue stuck to the palate due to the very thick saliva. So this thick saliva corresponds to the mucous one, and this is due to the sympathetic innervation. It is released or secreted. But if you have a fine resting situation and you digest, then the saliva, which is thin, freely flowing, containing many enzymes, so the serous saliva is produced. So this is the function of the fibers of the fascia, to release the serous saliva. Next nerve, also special sensory, belongs to the special senses, responsible for perception of acoustic information and the perception of the position of the body, so the balance and equilibrium, and that is called vestibulocochlear nerve. Explanation you need. The vestibule, you are going to hear this somewhat later. Vestibule is part of the inner ear, in which hair cells are sitting, and the hair cells are responsible for perception of the body position, as well as the cochlea. Cochlea is snail, so there is a specific organ in the inner ear again, which makes these 2.5 turns like the snail does, and this contains the hair cells responsible for perception of the acoustic information. So that's why it is called vestibulocochlear, and purely special sensory fibers make up this nerve. Next is the glossopharyngeal. The ninth is the glossopharyngeal. I think you understand both components of the nerve, of the name. Glossus is tongue, and pharynx is the tube behind the oral cavity. You must know this. So this is the glossopharyngeal, and again consists of all the 4 possible types of fibers. Somatosensory fibers innervating the upper part, the muscles of the somatosensory takes information from posterior part of the tongue, the pharynx, mucous membrane of the pharynx. The special sensory is responsible for taste sensation, and posterior 1/3 of the tongue sends information through fibers of glossopharyngeal to the central nervous system. The somatomotor, that's what I started to tell, muscles of the pharynx are innervated by mostly upper part of the muscles of the pharynx, and the parasympathetic fibers are innervating glands, again, only one gland, the biggest salivary gland, the parotid gland. And the parotid gland, I think you've learned in histology, purely consists of serous acini, so this one has a heavy function, of course, the parasympathetic, because all these serous acini are to be innervated by the fibers of it. Next is the vagus nerve. The vagus means wandering around, so going for a long distance and just walking around everything. This is the name because fibers of it from the brainstem go as far as down as the transverse colon. Transverse colon also you've learned. Transverse colon, so quite a long distance. The GI tract is traced by fibers of the vagus nerve. So that's for the name. Also extremely mixed, all the 4 possible types it does contain. Somatosensory for lower half of the pharynx, somatomotor, again muscles of pharynx and larynx, the pharynx, the lower half of the pharynx, and the parasympathetic for innervation of glands, most of the internal organs containing glands, as well as other internal function. Parasympathetic function is under influence of the vagus nerve. The accessory nerve, it means that accessory, so belonging to something, could be considered as a part of the vagus, so just joining the vagus. And it is purely somatomotor, only two muscles are innervated by this, as well as the hypoglossal, that is the last one, below the tongue, that's the name, where the name comes from. And this is again purely somatomotor. You saw that many nerves are purely somatosensory. There are some of them purely somatomotor, and there are some which are mixed. So these were the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and after that, of course, the 31 pair of spinal nerves are to be discussed. I don't know how much details you've learned about the vertebral column, but hopefully at least numbers of different types of vertebrae you are familiar with. There are 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 3 to 6 coccygeal vertebrae. This is needed to determine or to create names of the segments of the nerves of the spinal cord, and each of the segment to each of the segments a pair of spinal nerve belongs. Let's see how segments are created, because if someone makes a longitudinal cut through the spinal cord, there are no borders between parts of it. So the continuity exists continuously, the structure is the same, but something makes the spinal cord segmented. First, there are fibers going into the spinal cord according to a vertical line and the posterolateral side of the spinal cord, and similarly fibers leave through an anterior medial stripe or line. These are joining together, so either splitting if they are motor or joining together if they are sensory, into roots. There's therefore a dorsal root and a ventral root, or rather ventral root and dorsal root, and these roots unite to form nerves. The roots are, as I told you, clearly afferent, so somatic and autonomic sensory fibers getting into the spinal cord, and through the ventral roots, somato-motor and autonomic motor fibers leave. This not all refers to that autonomic motor fibers, not through all the ventral roots leave the spinal cord, but through some of them. Later it comes to be mentioned, just a couple of minutes. So the spinal nerve is formed by the union of dorsal and dorsal roots. Before that, the dorsal root has got a swollen part, which contains accumulation of pericardia, nerve cell bodies, because those are on the dorsal root. Therefore, this is a sensory ganglion, according to the definition I told you before. So spinal nerve is formed. Now, why nerves should be formed by these union of these roots time after time, or sequence after sequence? Because to leave this fairly closed vertebral column, vertebral canal, only holes between the vertebrae are used. These are the intervertebral foramina. So according to that, we can create a definition of a segment. Segment is that part of the spinal cord, vertical part of the spinal cord, from where dorsal and ventral roots unite to form a single spinal nerve. So that is one segment. After leaving the intervertebral foramen, each nerve splits into 2 rami. There is one ventral ramus and one dorsal ramus. Both of them are mixed, so containing all possible types of the fibers. One thing is wrong on this illustration, because as a general rule, we can say that ventral rami always are thicker than the dorsal ones, And this comes from the simple fact that spinal cord is not in the axis of the body, but fairly positioned to the back. Therefore, more fibers are needed for this bigger anterior portion to be innervated than those needed for the innervation of the back. So the ventral ramus is usually thicker. Now, the spinal segments and the spinal nerves are named after the corresponding vertebra. Almost everywhere the number of segment corresponds to the number of the vertebrae, except at the cervical region, as well as here at the end. At the cervical region, instead of having 7 pairs of spinal nerves, like the number of the cervical vertebrae is 7, we've got 8 pairs. The reason for that they're always above the corresponding vertebra, the corresponding nerve leaves. So above the third vertebra, the third spinal nerve leaves. And at last, till the last one, above the seventh, but below the 7th vertebra, the nerve is still called cervical nerve, and that's why this one should be the 8th spinal nerve. After that, the number of pairs of nerves correspond to that of the vertebrae, and always the corresponding nerve comes below the same numbered vertebrae. So below the 12th comes the last thoracic, the 12th thoracic nerve. Same applies to the lumbar. There are 5 pairs in number, and always they leave or enter below the corresponding vertebra. So below the 4th is the 4th lumbar spinal nerve is found. Same applies to the sacral vertebrae. Number corresponds to the number of the vertebrae, and always above below the corresponding vertebra they leave. Now here is the other exception when there is a discrepancy between the number of the vertebrae and the segments. Instead of having 3 to 6 coccygeal, only 1 coccygeal segment exists. Exiting from it, 1 pair of coccygeal nerve we've got. Spinal nerves should be there are some similar characteristics of the spinal nerve, rules you can create. One of them is that the ventral rami love to get together, love to have a bow, and this union of them is called the plexus, so they form spinal nerve plexuses. There is one exception. The most segmented part of our body is the thoracic, so there's almost similar structures put underneath each other. These are the segments. Snakes are more segmented, cervical vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, the snakes have got. We only have got these segments at the thoracic region. And in this region, the ventral rami remain individual. They turn into the proper intercostal space, and they are called, therefore, intercostal nerves. Intercostal nerves are nothing but ventral rami of thoracic spinal nerves. The dorsal rami never get together. Those are individuals, and they do not meet each other. These are the general rules for ventral and dorsal rami. The plexuses, which are formed by ventral rami, this is again definition, nerve plexus is formed by ventral rami of spinal nerves, and you must know, maybe not, which spinal nerve formed with union of ventral rami, or which spinal nerve formed different plexuses. The highest of them is the cervical plexus, mostly the head and neck is innervated by fibers of it. Then comes the brachial plexus, which is responsible for innervation of the upper limb. Lumbar sacral plexus is to innervate the lower limb. Another general thing, the sensory fibers are innervating stripes of the skin. So this is really segmentation. The stripes look a little bit strange if you look at the upside down body, but if you imagine an individual standing on 4 legs like the animals do, then these stripes become completely vertical, running around, concentrically around the anus. That's how these dermatomes, one stripe innervated by one spinal nerve is called a dermatome. So that's how the dermatomes are created. Another important thing, I told you that I'm going to mention this, that autonomic fiber content of the spinal nerves differs. One of the things I told you, some of the spinal nerves do not contain autonomic fibers at all, and that applies to the cervical region. After that, the thoracolumbar, together to be mentioned, the thoracolumbar region has got sympathetic fibers, and after that comes the sacral region, where again parasympathetic fibers leave. If you remember the composition of the cranial nerves, then you can imagine these different levels of exit of autonomic motor fibers. The cranial nerves only had parasympathetic. If a cranial nerve had autonomic, then this was parasympathetic. Then the cervical is empty. Cervical spinal nerves do not contain autonomic fibers. And the thoracolumbar now sympathetic, and the sacral is again parasympathetic. So very nice levels of autonomic outflow exists. It's a beautiful word, irradiation of the autonomic fibers according to different levels of the central nervous system. Now, I told you that you must know which the ventral ramus of which spinal nerve contributes to the plexuses, and it's good to memorize. The first cervical till the fourth cervical, the ventral rama unite into cervical plexus. Most important branch of it is the phrenic, which phrenos is the diaphragm, which innervates the diaphragm, as well as the sensory fibers of it innervate the pleura and the pericardium. You've learned these things, between which the nerve itself goes down, of course, takes information from these two serous membranes as well. The brachial plexus, as we said before, innervates the upper limb. Other fibers, I told you, the skin of the head and neck. Brachial plexus. Median, the main branches are to be known, the median and ulnar nerve. Maybe you've learned them in the first semester stuff when you dealt with the parts of the body and different limbs, maybe the biggest muscle groups you've learned, and skin innervation, I doubt. So the median nerve and the ulnar nerve are the ones which innervate flexors of the forearm and muscles of the hand. Skin of anterior surface of the upper limb also gets innervation from the median and ulnar, and the radial is the one which is responsible for innervation of everything behind. So both skin and muscles on the extensor side are innervated by the radial nerve. Then comes, so the thoracic empty, there are no plexuses on the thoracic region. The lumbar plexus comes next. Femoral nerve you've learned and hopefully you saw in the body. So big nerve innervating the anterior surface of the thigh, extensors of the thigh. And the other big nerve is the obturator, responsible for the medial group of the medial muscle group of the thigh, the adductors of the thigh, as well as the skin of anterior surface of the thigh, innervated by the branches of lumbar plexus. Sciatic plexus, L4S3, as you can see, the biggest nerve of the body leaves the sciatic plexus, that is the sciatic nerve, and that is responsible for innervation of the flexors, the posterior side of the thigh, as well as the muscles of the leg and the skin as well of the lower limb. Pudendlohemorrhoidal plexus is the last one, S1, S4 is the origin of the fibers. Name of it, if you have not heard before, pudendal comes from the name of external genitalia. In the perineal region are the external genitalia. These are the pudendal structures. By now you had to learn these things, I hope. And the hemorrhoidal part of the word comes from the enlarged varicosities of the veins in the wall of the rectum around the anus. These are the hemorrhoids. So the name suggests to you that everything on the perineal region, including the posterior part, the anal region, should receive innervation through nerves, mainly pudendal nerve and the muscles of the pelvic floor, as well as skin of external genitalia. These are the things innervated by. See you soon again, because we should continue with the central nervous system after this. Good luck in studying. Thank you for watching.